So I thought it'd be easier to explain the design, some of the techniques and tips I've learned through sharing some of the products that were developed online virtually over the last 2 years. And sometimes it's easier to understand these concepts when you're seeing them visually. It helps to remember them. I like a lot of visual thinking when I teach design because it helps to express, it helps to clarify, it helps to also decode ideas and encode new thinking. So visual thinking has always been a big part of my online virtual facilitation. But today what I want to do is I really want to explain and highlight some of my top tips that I've learned over the last 2 years facilitating online. It was, for me, a big shift. I learned design in person, very comfortable in person, loved facilitating in person, loved that energy, that dynamic energy that you can get bouncing ideas, that synergy in person. But with the pandemic, it was a forcing function for everybody to go virtually. And I had the opportunity in 2020 and 2021 to step in as a contractor for CFC and lead the capstone exercise design activity. Philippe usually leads that activity, and it's been very successful over the last few years with Shifting Sands, which is a very much in-person design activity with many facilitators and syndicates working independently. So in order to do this for 2020 and to keep the program moving, we had to reimagine how to take exercise Shifting Sands and reimagine it in a virtual or online space. So keeping all of the important components, but where we had to modify in order to be able to deliver the similar type of learning experience. So this is the placemat for Exercise Pegasus that was launched in 2020 at Canadian Forces College. And we had a number of principles that we really focused on. If you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, the little compass. Integration of learning was really important. We did a little bit of a model flip, learning from some of our design colleagues internationally of how they teach virtually. And instead of teaching design, they were really designing a learning model. And so that's what we wanted to really emphasize here in this particular program. We wanted to maintain an agnostic approach, but we really wanted to double down on some key skill sets like systems and anticipatory thinking with foresight, which gets a little bit into Todd's comments and tip around planning. So you need to understand what you want to accomplish from a plan and have a learning objective attached to it so that you're able to deliver on it. So with this, we did some preparation, as you can see on the placemat. We did some, students were able to kind of select a systems method that either a civilian method or a military method, but the idea was to learn some of the fundamental concepts of systemic thinking and to bring that to their group. We worked students at the individual, group level and collective level. And so that was the beauty of working online, is that we could actually take advantage of that collective intelligence and working as a network instead of just in silos. And we did that through use of discussion boards and other ways to connect all the teams together. We did some work on systems, some problem framing and systems thinking. And as Todd mentioned earlier, with complex systems, really challenging. So we spent a good part of our time focusing on that to really understand. And that was the hardest part for a lot of students because, you're going down a lot of rabbit holes. You've got to be very patient. And but it really was an important part of understanding the landscape and understanding an opportunity in that space, that design challenge where you want to go a little deeper and explore from a design perspective. And then we also did some strategic thinking, anticipatory thinking, and then we brought all the ideas together. So some of them were, different stages depending on how much time we had. But it was a new way of thinking in terms of what we were asking the students to do. So come up with an understanding of the problem, a new way to ideate and to prototype a solution or a path forward or something that they can share. And that was done via placemat, and it was done in a Dragon's Den format. But we did it all virtually, and we even did a virtual gallery, so that all the students can learn from each other's work. So this is just kind of a highlight, captures kind of our process overall. But going through this process, I learned a lot about online facilitation, and I learned in real time and had to pivot. And that's one thing, if you're new to online facilitation, just the more work you can do up front to plan is very important. And then be prepared to pivot, because you're going to learn things in real time, so you need to kind of, understand your audience and be prepared to pivot if things aren't perhaps landing the way you thought they were. And so to keep the momentum going. I like to start with, talking about facilitation or any kind of design with design models and methods, because it's the way I think a lot when I approach even planning. And one thing I learned when I was starting to translate exercise Shifting Sands to exercise Pegasus, the virtual model, was that, design is the paradigm of design, and the thinking of design is very much around a system of doing it in person. And there's a narrative to that. And a narrative is a very important thing to understand. It's the mental model you see at the bottom of this iceberg. It's also known as causal layered analysis, but it's a system. And our mental models really kind of drive our thinking, our beliefs, and then our actions. So there are a lot of assumptions and a lot of narratives around designing online that I had to overcome, even my own narrative, and really reimagine a structure that would be able to deliver a different learning experience and a different journey for students. So I want to point out here the importance of understanding the mental model and how that translates into how you may challenge that thinking and introduce new processes in your design facilitation to address some of those issues. So the tip one that I want to highlight here is be aware of these narratives and assumptions. There were 4 that came out right at the beginning when I would speak to a variety of facilitators that had significant expertise facilitating in person. One of the biggest ones was online is a passive learning experience. We had to challenge that thinking, and how can we make it active and engaging and keep students motivated. So we had to really think about that as we were planning and designing the structure. Another one was designing in a virtual environment is too difficult for beginners. We know it can be challenging. It can be intimidating to learn and to design and use these virtual tools. I certainly, as an experienced designer, was a little nervous about some of it the first few times as well. So we had to think about, okay, how can we introduce this in a way that's simple enough that gives you the basic skills to get the job done. You don't have to do the fancy every task, every bell and whistle that is on a platform, but what's the basics? A third one was there's a resistance to learn and use new tools. And so how do we overcome that resistance? Because usually there's resistance when you're changing something, introducing something. So how do we build familiarity with these online tools where it becomes something that they're used to and becomes a background, just tool, and it doesn't inhibit the design facilitation? Because really what you want is you want good discussion, because design is all about challenging thinking. It's about capturing ideas and insights, and you don't want your tools to be a barrier and to be distraction for that flow of dialogue. So how can you do it and introduce it so that it's simple and it reduces resistance? And the last one was it's very difficult to balance synchronous with asynchronous activities. And we found that the first time a little bit true. It was challenging. You had to think about how are you going to use your block of time. You don't want to be on Zoom or online for 6 hours straight. That's not effective. So how do you want to break up your block of time? How much is synchronous and how much is asynchronous that allows for students to be able to reflect, perhaps process, maybe do some more reading, some more research, and come back to the team with some fresh ideas and fresh thinking. So all of these are really important. So if you're going to facilitate any kind of online design workshop, whether it's 1 hour or multi-days, you want to kind of be aware of what is the narrative and assumption, and how are you going to work so that this way you're addressing that, and it doesn't become a barrier for you. The second one, before you even start facilitating, is empathy, right? I'm a big fan of empathy, but it's understanding your audience, because different audiences, you have different approaches, and they'll have a different perspective. And some audiences have absolutely no exposure or experience with design. They've never used a tool. So you want to understand that, and you want to curate the experience in a way that it's not intimidating, and it's straightforward. And it allows you also to understand the context and the learning needs of that audience, right? So that you're matching up tools, methods that are at the right level. You don't want to introduce something too complicated that's more advanced for a beginner audience. So you really want to have that understanding of, okay, what's their background? What do they want to learn? What do you want to get out of this experience? And how are you going to plan? So you want to prepare that. And then what are some of those advanced things that your participants can do to prepare themselves so that they can come ready to lean in and to really start with the design process? That's pretty important. So those are the two that are really important before you even start facilitating, is really have an understanding there and being able to kind of sketch out a bit of a process. Then when it gets to step 3, it's really about your structure. So how are you going to design for online facilitation and learning? And you want to build structure. Now, the structure I have here, the visual, is very detailed because it was for exercise Pegasus, which was a very complicated type of exercise. But if you look at some of the components on its own, it's really understanding the purpose and context and what you're learning. It's understanding some of the methods and maybe how you're going to phase it. If it's, maybe it's a one-day workshop and you're going to cover 3 distinct learning objectives and three methods, or is it multi-day where you're taking students on a journey and there's an evolution in thinking? So that's really important because your approach is going to be a little different. And then you want to think about your structure and all your tools. Like, what are your basic tools that you need to get the job done? There are a lot of great tools out there. And if you, I like Mural personally. I also like Miro, M-I-R-O. Concept Board is excellent too. They all have very common features. But what I've noticed is that you just need the basics. You need students to be able to log in. You need them to be able to create a sticky note. You need to be able to cluster, sort, distill insights, maybe upload visuals, things like that. These are some basic things and skills that you really want your tool to be able to do. Perhaps for more advanced students, you might also want to introduce other features, but just be mindful that the more features you introduce to a new audience, it might be distracting. So you want to think about, okay, if I'm going to introduce them, why and how, so that it doesn't disrupt your flow within your design session. And then, of course, the process, right? We had a number of processes, but I think the biggest one is the collaboration, right? And really helping teams to be able to work through whatever method or that they're using to share their ideas and distill insights as a collective and to be able to move that forward is really important. So as I mentioned earlier, we kind of flipped the model from a design model to a learning model. And so that was really driving us, is how can we learn individually, collectively as a team, and then some informal learning through sharing through Dragon's Den. So we were very intentional with our process, and we had open-ended questions for discussion prompts to really try to create an active learning environment. So lots of opportunity for engagement in different ways, both synchronously and asynchronously. So something to think about as you're creating your system or your structure. And again, it can be very simple. It doesn't have to look like this, but these are some of the things you want to keep in mind. Tip 4 is just become familiar with your virtual environment. So whatever tool you decide you're going to go for, great. So become familiar with it and play with it in an informal way with your group before your challenge. And so it allows you to test it out, some basic functions, which is really important. Don't be afraid on Zoom to use breakout rooms as well, because if you have a team of 10 people, sometimes there will be others that are not contributing as equally because, maybe a few are kind of dominating the discussion. So when you break it out into smaller groups, it allows for different levels of discussion. You can also break the challenge into 2 areas. So you have teams working synchronously, but on different parts of the challenge, so you can maximize, the insights. So be creative with your breakout rooms, and really you're wanting to engage everybody in the dialogue. So that's important. Consider an icebreaker activity, as I mentioned, and it can be something very simple. And I have a couple of examples of what it looked like for us. But you want to practice some basic skills and make it fun. Make it fun so that it just becomes a little second nature. And think about the different styles of facilitation. There's a lot of different styles. Some facilitators are very heavy on facilitation. So they'll do everything behind the scenes on the digital whiteboard. And the participant or the student kind of can lean back a lot. And they're more in the dialogue. So they're not as active on the virtual or necessarily online playing with the tool. But what I've noticed over the last few years, what I've tried to do is find that balance between facilitating and then handing it over to students so they get practice doing it. And so it's a little bit more of a coaching facilitation, which really is helpful for, again, maximizing engagement and helping participants become familiar with the tool and feel confident they could use it again in the future. And these are just some examples of some of the exercises that we did here at CFC, where it was just like, drag and drop, uploading pictures, finding thematic things. Like they were just simple, fun things, but it allowed students or participants to be able to use the tool in a very simple way and to understand the functions. And here's another one about finding connections, different teams. And this was a little bit of an icebreaker with the teams, learning about each other and then finding connections across different teams. So we did this all virtually, and this was set up ahead of time just to kind of maximize the time spent with students. And then this is when we did recently this year, where it was part of the Foresight workshop, where we did a little 30-minute exercise, and all 6 teams went into the whiteboard and they played with the futures triangle, and they started to play with the sticky notes and input, some stuff. So again, it's introducing them, but it's also, breaking down that mystery and helping them become more familiar with the tool. And the last tip, hopefully I'm not over time. The last tip is maintaining motivation and helping students stay focused. This is probably one of the challenging things, especially if you're in a multi-day type design challenge. You really want to have, if you have like any kind of design lecture or design brief, you want to keep them really short and tight to allow for as much time for design facilitation. And we did that regularly because we wanted all of our teams to be progressing, at the same time with the same basic knowledge for design, but then applied in different ways within their own syndicate. So we had little design briefs on common theory for about 15, 20 minutes. And then, within the day, students were doing 60 to 90-minute cycles of design screen time with specific objectives. And we did regular, like as I mentioned, daily briefs, and these were checks, right? And we called them vector checks to make sure everybody was progressing, because we had phases that they had to progress through, and we wanted to make sure all the students completed. Again, this is a multi-day type of, session, 5+ days where you don't want any students to be left behind. We use discussion boards. This was really great for helping with reflective thinking, distilling ideas, putting on the board, helping students respond. And it influenced their thinking, and it gave them new insights. So it was like a little bit of trying to tap into that network type of effect. And then our instructors worked as a facilitation cell. So we have met regularly and we supported each other with questions. And so this way we were really trying to make sure all the teams were successful. And we had to pivot sometimes in real time when things didn't work. And so be prepared for that and be ready to pivot. And that's why if you have a facilitation cell, always great to take those challenges back to yourself. And then you come up with lots of ideas of how to pivot in real time. So you can keep the motivation of your participants constant. And so these are just some examples from this year's CFC. This was from Exercise Lookout as part of this year's, it was tagged with Exercise Pegasus, but it was the National Security Program was doing foresights. So this is just an example of what the student curation looked like. And so a little bit of theory and then them working on it and developing insights along the way. So it can look a little bit messy, but it's the insights that you want to be able to distill out and move forward into a final product. And here's another example from this year's Exercise Lookout. Again, just different methods, different ways of drilling down and capturing insights and understanding the space. And then this is an example of it done internationally at a conference. It was 90 minutes. It was completely open to the public. It was done, I did it in the Philippines with the Center for Engaged Foresight. And we had 80 people log in, and we had 90 minutes to take them through. So this was a very forward-leading facilitation process because people didn't have the knowledge to facilitate or use the whiteboards. So it was more the discussion, but this is how it can be done within a short period of time. And as you can see, there's a lot of curation that happens when you have a compressed time because you want to maximize and you don't want to lose any time at all, with your participants in the discussion. So that kind of just wraps up some of the things that I've learned